Welcome back, everybody. So our keynote this afternoon is from Dr. Kim TallBear from the University of Alberta, who will be joining us virtually today. We are going to be, we have an in-person host, Dr. Savage Bear, who is going to assist us in getting through this keynote with Dr. TallBear. So Dr. Savage Bear is a rabble-rouser, Nehiyawisque, and member of the Montreal Lake Cree Nation in northern Saskatchewan. She is the director for the McMaster Indigenous Research Institute and is an assistant professor within the Indigenous Studies Department. Savage is also the national director of Walls to Bridges, an education program bringing post-secondary education to incarcerated and formerly incarcerated folks. Before coming to McMaster, Bear worked at the University of Alberta, where she was the director of the Indigenous Women and Youth Resilience Project and the academic lead on Indigenous Canada, a highly successful online course boasting over 500,000 learners. She was also an assistant professor of Native Studies and Women's and Gender Studies. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bear to the stage to introduce our second keynote presenter, Dr. Kim TallBear.
That was my introduction. So some of you may have known me as Tracy Bear, but I have upgraded to Savage Bear, much to my great auntie's chagrin. So I'm here to introduce you to I guess she was a former colleague. I was at the U of A with her. I'm at McMaster now. Some of the things that Kim and I have done together, I guess is what's landed me right here to introduce her. So Kim TallBear, there was a lot of jokes around the Faculty of Native Studies, the fact that she is quite tall and I'm not that tall. And so I was the bear and she was the tall bear. But Dr. Kim TallBear is an enrolled member of the Sisseton, Wahpeton, Oyate, and descended from the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes of Oklahoma. She also holds a Canada Research Chair at the U of A in Indigenous Peoples, Technoscience, and Society. She's a full prof in the Faculty of Native Studies at U of A. And she's a regular on Media Indigena. So if you haven't heard of that yet, she's on there and gives her brilliance to us all. She's also the author of the Native American DNA, Tribal Belonging, and the False Promise of Genetic Science. Kim and I also, along with Kirsten Lindquist, we also were co-producers of a little show called Teepee Confessions, which was really where I got to know Kim TallBear. Going through some of the confessions of the audience was really quite an amazing challenge for many of us. So without further ado, we're going to have Kim on here and please give her a warm welcome today.
Thank you, Professor Bear. I thought you were going to make a joke about my inability to say certain words in TV confessions. Okay, so we're here to talk about more serious matters than sex, although sex is a serious matter. I am not going to give a very formal keynote today. I wrote and asked for some guidance on what to talk about. I'm called by the media quite a lot. I'm just going to take note of what time it is here and try not to go on too long. I do really value Q&A, and I assume we're going to have some time for Q&A and all of this. So I get called on the media quite a lot, and I have been called on since 2012, actually, to talk about false claims to Native identity. I was first called in 2012 by Boston.com when this online source was doing a news story on Elizabeth Warren when she was running for US Senate for Massachusetts in 2012, and a Republican opponent had called her Pocahontas and accused her of making false claims to Cherokee identity. And this story again ramped up in the news cycle in 2018 when Senator Warren was then being considered for the nomination to Democratic Party nomination to run for US president. And it's really ramped up again in the last couple of years with all of these high profile identity fraud cases in both the US and Canada. I was getting called in to talk about the DNA aspects of it, but got a de facto education This is not something I set out to research. I got a de facto education on these issues on many cases as I started getting called by the press many months before these stories break. And so unfortunately, this issue has derailed a lot of my own research since January of 2021. And I probably should write a book on this, but I'm really resisting that. There are a lot of other things I want to do than talk about Native identity fraud. So the conference organizers, when I said, hey, you know, what exactly do you want me to talk about, said, why don't you organize your comments around 3 questions? And I'm going to spend most of my time actually talking about the first of those 3 questions, which I'll get to those in a minute. But before I start, I want to call your attention to a forthcoming essay that I just read in draft and commented on. And that is an essay by my University of Alberta colleague, Dr. Jessica Kolopenik, who has just moved from the Faculty of Native Studies to a research chair in Indigenous Health at the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Alberta. Although she and I are still going to co-direct the summer internship for Indigenous Peoples in Genomics Canada and our Indigenous Science Studies program at the University of Alberta. So we're still working really closely together. But she gave me this essay to comment on that she's got in draft, and I'm hoping that it's going to be out in an open access online form very soon. And the essay she wrote is very much needed, and it actually addresses one of the key lessons that settled into my brain since I started being called on so frequently by the press in the last 2 years to comment on these cases. The problem I've seen arise in the wake of these breaking pretendian cases, race shifter cases, I'm sure you've had a lot of debate today about the terminology for these, and there's advantages and disadvantages to all of those terms. But one of the problems I've seen arise in the wake of these cases is one that Dr. Kolopenik focuses on in that essay. And that is the truly unfortunate degree to which white-coded and sometimes, not always, disconnected, that's their term, natives, the fact that they are often conflating their situations with blatant frauds. So in her essay, Dr. Kolopenik calls especially white-coded natives to not conflate the identity frauds with themselves, to resist that kind of identity insecurity, and to not make Native community pushback to pretendianism about themselves. Rather, white-coded natives need to acknowledge and interrogate their own white privilege. Kolopenik's insight into what she calls the pretendian problem is that, quote, we must continue to name whiteness, model Indigenous relationality when grappling with one's own white privilege and when responding to calls from community about who we are and who we belong to. And she says we must learn from Indigenous women's leadership on this issue. I assume you've already talked about Indigenous women and their central role in calling this stuff out today. So I will also add, people need to stop scapegoating Indigenous women, especially when they refuse to play the settler respectability politics game. I've seen white-coded and or self-defined reconnecting natives scapegoat visibly Indigenous women, as well as center their own identity insecurity as they come to terms in public, on social media, or in published pieces with their grief and feelings of being used and deceived by frauds, sometimes who they had earlier defended. Again, the fraud situation isn't about those who have living family and community and who can reconnect. Such people should stop making it about themselves. Dr. Kolopenik highlights the sometimes delicate questions about belonging that we all face at some point from our communities, whether we're connected or reconnecting. This is what our Indigenous communities, I'm going to put scare quotes around that too, and I'll come back and talk about that soon. This is what Native communities regularly do. We check who we're related to. And sometimes it might feel less than kind, but it is a common way of making connections and establishing context for how to relate to one another. Responding to questions about who our relatives are will never lessen, nor should it. And such questions can help facilitate authentic networks of connection. So Dr. Kolopenik gives you some personal anecdotes in this article too, and talks about how she has worked through a difficult situation like that. So it's really helpful to think with her, and she's a pretty sophisticated theorist on the intersections of race and indigeneity. So I can't wait for you all to read that essay, and I hope that she'll get some invitations to give a talk on this topic in the near future. Okay, so the questions I was asked to respond to today are, the first one is, what has changed for me since the first National Identity Forum? And I noticed that the name was changed now to the second National Citizenship Forum. I think that's a good thing. So that's the first question posed to me. And I'm going to spend most of my time on this question today. So in the last year, I've gained more clarity that false claims to ancestral connections are given cover. And I'm not going to, this is not in any particular order. These are just the things I've learned. So I've gained more clarity that false claims to ancestral connections are given cover under the shadow of the actual biological connections that race shifters produce to actual Native people when they marry in and have children. This painfully entangles and implicates actual Native extended families and communities in multi-generational lies and acts of race shifter appropriation. So we must be clear on the difference between original false claims to ancestry and produce biological relatedness by marrying in. Making babies with Native people doesn't erase the original and ongoing lies. The second thing that I've come to understand, it's become clear to me that we need to, and this might be a minor issue, but I want to call attention to it anyway, because it's a common deflection by race shifters. We need to clearly articulate the difference between our relatively few legally adopted kin and citizens and the disingenuous and distorted cultural adoption discourses that race shifters often use to shield themselves from interrogation of their lies. As with making babies, it is true that we adopt kin, both ceremonially and legally. These types of adoptions are not synonymous. One may lead to Indigenous citizenship. It depends on tribal or band membership rules, and these change over time. The other form of ceremonial adoption does not lead to citizenship, at least not that I've ever seen. We must be clear again on the difference between original false claims to ancestry and citizenship and produced social ties with Indigenous individuals or families via ceremonial adoption. So as I noted in the first national forum, the term identity is a problem. I quoted from an essay I published in the 2020 Routledge Handbook of Critical Indigenous Studies. And in that essay, I noted that, quote, identity does not necessarily imply ongoing relating. It exists as a largely individualistic idea, as something considered to be held once and for all, unchanging within one's body, whether through biological or social imprinting. Identity is often considered as one's body's property. So we need to think carefully when we pull the identity word off the shelf. Is this really the idea that we care about? Or are we concerned with who is related, who is affiliated by family and or citizenship with our nations? We are concerned about collectivity. White settlers and others who do not hail from Native nations or tribal communities do genuinely often misunderstand, and it's in their material and psychic best interest to misunderstand what it is to be Métis or Cree, Cherokee, or Indigenous. They focus on these terms as connoting individual identity. And as a matter of personal choice, we should be more considered in our word choice so as not to enable their misunderstanding with our own uncareful deployment of the I word. Now, I understand that we're operating in English. A lot of the words that we have to choose from are really insufficient for communicating the complexity and the richness of the ideas within our cultures and our kinship and citizenship structures. But I'm asking again for people to be a little bit more careful and considered in their word choices, so we're not enabling non-Native appropriation of these ideas in ways that are not serving us. So this brings me to a second I word, Indigenous. Since the first national forum, I've become convinced that the term Indigenous is also a big problem. It's enabling vague, distant, contorted ancestral or lineal descent claims, alleged or actual, to unnamed or misnamed ancestors. Indigenous, as it's being promiscuously deployed, draws attention away from ideas of collectivity and belonging to First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and tribal communities. The term is being taken up sometimes by those who were not, in fact, Indigenous within the different robust definitions of indigeneity in their home nation states, but they find themselves in the US or Canada, then rely on very long ago ancestral connections to First Peoples on other continents to make new claims to indigeneity in our lands. Such claimants attempt to elevate long ago ancestral claims to equate their Indigenous status in these lands with ours, based solely on long ago ancestry, thereby challenging our tangible and ongoing kinship and governance structures in these our home territories. Such claimants increasingly attack and shout over our voices to establish their own moral claims in this place. And that is not unlike the playing Indian of white settlers since the 18th century in order to establish their moral claims to our lands, even though many claimants in the US and Canada to vague ancestral indigeneity from other parts of the world are not in fact white within current US and Canadian race definitions. The concept of Indigenous has become so expansive in its meaning in social discourse that it has become meaningless at best and is being used to actively undermine land and governance claims that stem from firstness in place and from our co-constitutive emergence as peoples or native nations with/in the lands and waters of this continent. I increasingly hear pushback to the term Indigenous by people and community, and I increasingly agree. So in summary, we must challenge the practice of claiming to be simply Indigenous based on distant ancestry alone, without reference to belonging in specific living collectives or nations. And as I've said in other places, if we can dispense with these ancestry alone claims, we don't have to go digging through people's genealogy. We need to be clear that we do not invoke Indigenous as a term disconnected from the ongoing collective presences and living governance authorities of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and tribal communities. We need to be clear that without these specific and place-based living collectives, Indigenous means very little. Indigenous has facilitated our global organization and our sharing lessons of colonial history and tactics, and our tactics and demands for decolonization. But despite its organizational usefulness, we cannot ignore the real risk presented by Indigenous discourse as the idea is appropriated and its meaning largely evacuated, with its solidification into an identity detached from belonging to long-standing, ongoing, living, place-based peoples who continue to forge agreements and disagreements with settler colonial governments in order to defend our lands and our own governance authorities. Okay, I've learned that this gross, pervasive Indigenous identity appropriation is a 21st century continuation of the Indian Wars. And I have to credit my friend and co-thinker Cedar Sherbert for that line. He's a Kumeyaay filmmaker and enrolled citizen of the Ipai Nation of the Santa Isabel Reservation in San Diego County, California. Cedar was instrumental in outing a major literary fraud, so-called Nasdij. His real name was Timothy Patrick Barris in 2006. Cedar Sherbert had been hired to write a screenplay adaptation of one of Barris's 3 supposed memoirs. In actuality, one of several disturbing fantasist accounts of Nasdij's supposed life as the son of an alcoholic Navajo mother and an abusive white cowboy father. Barris wrote disturbing and completely fabricated accounts that included rape and incest, all under this assertion that he was Navajo. The stories Barris wrote were, as Cedar Sherbert describes them, accounts that are rife with suffering. Sherbert explains in an online symposium, Unsettling Genealogies, that we both took part in last March of 2022, that, quote, "This is something pretendians do. They have these narratives of suffering and abuse." In reference to this particular piece of Barris's writing, Sherbert says, quote, "It was almost beyond human endurance, to the point it almost felt like a parody of abuse. Indeed, an overfocus on despair that flattens the lives of Native people into a sea of suffering is a classic pattern in pretendian accounts, as we've come to understand in our collective observations of their twisted thinking." The Nasdij case broke in the LA Weekly, January 23, 2006, written by a non-Native reporter, Matthew Fleischer. The story was simply called Nava Hoax. You can find it online. Fleischer, the reporter who wrote that story, now works for the San Francisco Chronicle, who many of you will remember broke the Marie Cruz, aka Sasheen Littlefeather story on October 22nd, 2022, written of course by Dene and Dakota investigative reporter Jacqueline Keeler. Cedar Sherbert and I were talking the other night as I prepared these remarks. We recounted together the aggression that Native women and others endure as we assertively confront the race shifter / pretendian phenomenon. Sherbert described what he called a cowboys versus Indians response to us, wherein we actual Native people are painted as the aggressors. Sherbert, remember he's a filmmaker, explained to me, and I was typing furiously as he talked, so I'm going to give you a quote, what he said. And he's thinking about all of this, right, in relationship to Hollywood in particular, because that's his area of expertise. He knows the networks, he knows the players, he's thinking about the history of film and the role of the kind of Indian motifs in the building of Hollywood. So he said, "It's like a cowboys and Indians movie which he later pointed out to me are the narratives that actually helped build the Hollywood empire. I guess I wasn't quite aware how central Westerns were to that. So in the Cowboys and Indians movie, we're going to take your land, and when you fight back, you're the savages and aggressors. They call us names. They make ad hominem attacks. This is the 2023 version of an old racist Western that made us the savages when they invaded land that wasn't theirs. We are painted as unintelligent, as brutes when we fight back, especially Native women who use the settlers' technological weaponry against them, i.e. social media. How dare they attack us for standing up for ourselves when all they do is take, take, take. This, meaning identity fraud, is the newest iteration of the Indian Wars. Some of those attacks have surrounded the Marie Cruz, aka Sasheen Littlefeather case. I have learned all over again through the Cruz case that genealogical and historical evidence don't matter to some people. They simply do not matter. We already know as Indigenous scholars that evidence that doesn't line up with settler supremacist thinking will be ignored. And we will be continuously trolled and individually attacked for insisting on the veracity of our data. And because both the left and the right, quotes around those, are ultimately settler categories and ways of making political sense of the world, the settler left is as guilty of being fantasist regarding Indians as is the right. I've learned that we individuals, Indigenous women, or investigative reporters who out frauds are going up against massive structures as individuals. And this puts us at a severe disadvantage. In conversation with people like Cedar Sherbert, Jacqueline Keeler, Gordon Henry at Michigan State, who organized the Unsettling Genealogies Forum, and in conversation with my sister Jody TallBear, who is an attorney who thinks a lot about the intersections of tribal sovereignty and civil rights in the US, that we need the collective and we need institutions to step up. Our individual efforts alone won't make the fundamental long-lasting change that we need. So first of all, this means that tribal governments, First Nations, and other Native Nation governance structures need to make statements on this issue, and they need to start making demands for settler institutional change. Widespread Indigenous identity fraud is, in fact, a serious risk to Native Nation sovereignty. We need to focus efforts on communicating how and why that is. Indigenous identity frauds are attacking the Indian Child Welfare Act, or ICWA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA. They're trying to get involved in that and get ancestral remains back. In Canada, we've had the recent Gitxsan custody case in which a quote-unquote Eastern Woodland Métis family challenged custody of a First Nations girl by her Gitxsan family. There are ongoing individual and small group efforts to pressure arts organizations, publishers, literary festivals, and it's frustrating to do this as individuals with emails and through social media. But if we had tribal governments backing us with the full force of tribal sovereignty and law, it would help us. Tribes, First Nations, and other Indigenous governance organizations could fund positions, a person or an office, within their governmental infrastructure to research identity frauds claiming to be them and return information to the nation. They could do press releases. They could coordinate with local media. In the United States, some tribes are major employers, so media, local governments, and institutions have incentive to pay attention. There should be concerted Native Nation pushback against groups trying to infiltrate NAGPRA, ICWA, and other Indigenous protective legal structures. Again, those claiming false Indigenous identity are using these laws and trying to access yet more resources. They're trying to access our children. They're trying to access our ancestral remains. In certain parts of the country, they're using it to access hunting and resource rights. This is a threat to Indigenous sovereignty. It is very clear this is not just some niche issue that a few people care about. It's not just identity politics. You see where that word identity is helping deflect from the seriousness of this issue. So in addition to Indigenous women pushing back either in public or quietly behind the scenes, and there are many people behind the scenes who are doing quite a lot and who don't want to be out about it publicly because look at the trolling we endure. We have the press to thank for the progress we have made, and I'm sure you've had some conversations about the role of the press too. It was not universities. It was not the publishing industry. It has not been arts organizations who have had the courage to step up until they felt the harsh gaze after highly embarrassing breaking stories. We have benefited from investigative reporters like Jackie Keeler in the San Francisco Chronicle, Jeff Leo for CBC, Matt Fleischer for LA Weekly, let me see if I can pronounce this correctly, Keynote Deer, and Jose Barrera for CBC, Jose Barrera again for APTN, Adam Elmarek and Paul Pringle for the LA Times, both Native and non-Native reporters, believe Native people when they said these terrible decades-long lucrative lies were being committed and resources were allocated to investigating these stories. But individual Native women and press alone cannot create systemic change. We need universities, settler and Native governments, media conglomerates, the Screen Actors Guild, the publishing industry to step up. You will be sickened if you read the 2006 LA Weekly Navajos article at the knowing complicity, well, in addition to all the sexual violence. You'll be sickened at the knowing complicity of big time publishers and Hollywood directors and producers in that identity fraud. Frauds are enabled by influential individuals across our societal institutions, people who also make money or raise their diversity numbers off of Indigenous identity fraud. Just like we know the Indian Wars didn't only enrich the US state, massacre and displacement of Indians enriched the wealthy capitalists and it enriched the citizenry. Similarly, all kinds of settler institutions and settler and newcomer individuals, including our universities, benefit from Indigenous identity fraud. Many of them, without legal, social, and economic consequences, will continue to enable it. So the second thing I was asked is, have we really made any progress toward ensuring the safety and security for legitimate Indigenous peoples in the academy? And how would I hope universities would respond in terms of processes and policy change? Hold on, I'm going to just mute myself. Okay, so I think it's more possible to speak now in large part because of the mouthy Native women who've spoken first and who have been trolled for it. In fact, I've seen former defenders of race shifters seem to find more space to speak because of the space made by Indigenous women and the press on these issues. And I'm a little bit torn by this. You know, I've noticed people coming forward, writing pieces in prominent news outlets or literary magazines, or being interviewed, and people who should have said something a long time ago, or who were maybe less, people who might have been well placed like me, who could have been saying things a long time ago, or people who might not have been so well placed, but because of the politics of their own whiteness or own disconnectedness, and that's their word, not mine, were defending frauds and conflating their situations. On one hand, I'm really happy for people, for the light bulb to come on and for them to say, oh, okay, yeah. Maybe this is a problem and let me reckon with this and let me now speak publicly about it. On the one hand, I really know that I should be very happy when people do that. We need more people to see what a problem this is. On the other hand, when you walk through a door opened by people who have been maligned and trolled for it, and then you act like they didn't open that door or don't explicitly acknowledge the door that was open through the hardship of others, I have a problem with that. So I'm kind of feeling both ways about this. So this brings me back to Jessica Kolopenik's advice too on how to contribute to these conversations in ways that aren't centering one's own individual identity challenges and insecurities, and instead focus on how to respond in ways that center our collectives. And I think we always have to remember that. Is my response centering the collective? Is it helping support the needs of the collective, right? Our nations and their needs for individual accountability, even when it feels personally uncomfortable for us. So part of that, I think, is resisting the call of settler institutions and media outlets to refocus stories on individual identity challenges and insist on the focus being on collective forms of belonging, be they family or citizenship, and we use these as our guideposts. So we need to be clear. And I think we have the mechanisms and robust kinship and citizenship structures in place in our nations to be clear about the difference between blatant fraud and the challenges that some of our people face who are interested in having more connected, relationships with their nations. And again, let's really focus on what the collective needs, right? And not necessarily, because settler institutions and media outlets, they always want to tell the individual story, right? It is not to their benefit to focus on the collective rights, collective, I don't want to use that word identity, right? But collective forms of belonging that we have. It is very much a collectivist versus individualistic kind of conceptual divide that we have here between Indian country, as I call it, being an American and settler society. So now, related to equity, diversity, and inclusion, or EDI, as we call it in Canada, they reverse those letters and call it DEI in the US. Without attention to Indigenous nations as governments and Indigenous citizenship and kinship rules as guideposts, EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion, as it is currently conceived in universities, is helping create our problems. It not only enables, but it encourages box checking. And I'm sure this is something we can talk about at length in Q&A if you like. If we require proof of Indigenous community affiliation, I wonder, will actual connected First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people, for example, in Canada, feel safer and more encouraged to apply for admission to our universities if they see us really assertively dealing with this, if we advertise the fact that this is important to us, right? And we put it on our scholarship applications and admissions applications and our job applications. Will actual connected people, right, feel safer in those institutions? Will they feel encouraged by the university taking a visible protective stance? I think our universities might be surprised at how many Native applications are made more numerous and robust with such policies. I think there's an idea by many in the university that, oh my gosh, if we start being too strict, if we start checking, what's going to happen to our diversity numbers? I think actual Native people might feel a lot more comfortable in those situations and places. So I just want to say something. I have to figure out how to talk about this. Because there's a lot of the cases we talk about are confidential, and I have to be careful about that. But I was asked for the last year, while one of our other Native faculty members was on leave, to sit as a one-year temporary member of the Committee for the Documentation of Indigeneity at the University of Alberta. And so I've learned a couple of things. We're only dealing with student cases right now, which I think we very much need to deal with faculty and staff cases. I'm not quite sure why it started that way. I wasn't around for the beginning of the committee, but I've still learned a few things about the challenges and the benefits of having committees like this. We need to build committees and mechanisms to vet Indigenous identity claims among existing and incoming faculty, staff, and students. It's very clear that we need to have these conversations, and we need to start committees like this. I think in some universities, I think it sounds to me, watching the news, like many more universities are coming to terms with the fact that they cannot bury their heads in the sand like UBC tried to do around the Mary Ellen Terpelefon case. And I know that was against the kind of protests of some of their Indigenous faculty there too, but we need to have the conversation. Trying to resist having the conversation, being silent, no comment, this is not a viable way forward. And I'm hoping that more and more university administrators are realizing, after all of these late-breaking cases, that they can start out trying to do that. That is, they are not going to be able to sustain that position. So some of the things I've learned on that committee, we actually have, and I knew this already, but it's good to have this reaffirmed. When you have a committee with First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people on it, we've got attorneys, we've got people like me who are Indigenous from somewhere else. We have extensive networks out among Native communities and nations, not only across Canada, but in the US and globally a bit too. We can vet these cases. We draw on our networks, right? I've had to do this in some of my own programs. When I've had an Indigenous participant from a particular program I want to apply for Mexico, I don't know anything about Indigenous categorization in Mexico. I drew on my network. I know people who do. This is a lot of work for us in the beginning, and we say that a lot. I mean, this is a problem presented by settler colonialism, by white supremacy, yet who's doing the hard work of responding to it? We have to do that, and that's just a fact of this situation. So it's a lot of work for us in the beginning, but I think we have the capacity and the networks and the generosity and the care to do this work and do it well. I've been amazed by the level of nuance and deep care that we've had in these conversations towards including a real diverse set of actual Indigenous people. Policy change, I think, on the university-wide level is going to be slow. This is due to legal challenges, and we've got attorneys that are in conversation with us. So they're really helping us think through what the legal implications might be at every step of the way. There's union law. I don't think academic unions get this at all. And that's going to be slow and challenging to change. But I think, again, we cannot fear the conversation. And we do have, at places like the University of Alberta, I can't speak for every institution, but we have a lot of really highly skilled, smart, experienced Indigenous faculty, staff, student support people and students who are doing this work as well. So I think we can have these really meaningful, smart conversations and figure out how to do this. So I just want us to know that I think we do have the capacity to deal with this. But again, it's calling on us to do a lot of work again to deal with the problems that we have inherited from a settler colonial white supremacist society. So I think I'm going to stop. That's the kind of end of my written comments, but I'm really interested. I don't know if Professor Bear has any questions that she wants to start out with, but I'm also really interested in the Q&A. And I'm really sorry that I missed earlier conversations today. I always like to draw earlier conversations in a symposium into my own remarks, but this is the third talk I've given today. So I'm a little out of it.
Thank you, Kim. That was absolutely amazing. Can we give a round of applause for that brilliance? Awesome. I don't have burning questions. I have no answers to any of these questions. We've been questioning a lot. And Kim, when you referred to, you guys probably talked about that. Yes, we have. We've been talking about this, and it's been really great having this type of forum, the citizenship forum. So I imagine we have some online questions and we have questions from the audience. So we have Mike is our runner, our mic runner. Mike is a mic runner. It's awesome. All right.
I don't get to see the audience, huh?
Oh, you don't? Who do you see? Do you see me?
I just see you. You look great. I love your new hairdo.
That's you. All right. There's a question over here, Mike. Okay.
Hi, Kim, thank you so much for speaking today. Really appreciated your words. I have a question for you, and I'm just wondering if you would be able to expand on the EDI currently helps create the problem.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if you can expand on that.
Well, I think, and I go between the US and Canada so much too, and I try to be really careful about how I talk about the differences and the similarities. Because, I know how sensitive Native people are up there about this, and I agree with this. It's so easy, though, to look better than the US because the US is such a low bar. So, like, when I say that I feel like we're doing better in Canada, it's not because Canada's better. It's number one, because the US is such a low bar, and number two, because Native people in lands now called Canada have been much more assertive on this issue. And so I say that as a background to the problems with EDI. I think, but despite the assertiveness of Native people in Canada to this issue, we still have these kinds of, and we talk a lot about this in Native community up there. We still have this discourse of multiculturalism, right? And I think despite the fact that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people are not considered part of this broad spectrum of racial categories in official Canadian policy in the way we are in the United States, there's still an attention to what's distinct about Indigenous as a category, or First Nation, Métis, and Inuit. There's still this dominant discourse of multiculturalism that's infusing equity, diversity, and inclusion discourse and programming. And so I think there is not enough respect for Indigenous, Native nation specific kinship and citizenship structures. And the fact that we need to focus on belonging to a collective, there's still too much emphasis on what multicultural discourse produces, which is an attention to individual identity and choice in that identity. And this is a really hard thing for non-Native people to accept, that we're not talking about individual identity choice here. We really are talking about respecting the rules, whether they're kinship or citizenship rules, of Native nations as collectives. And so if the system's designed to respond in an equity, diversity, and inclusion way that's focused on individualism and on personal identity claims, how do we get them to refocus on the kinds of collectivist definitions that we want to foreground? I don't think the system's set up to do that yet. But there may be others, Native people in administration and universities who have actually been in Canada a lot longer than me, who have a more nuanced response to this too. But that's my take, given my 7.5 years in Alberta now, and that level of experience that I have.
Thank you. Great question. Any other questions? Comments? Yes, over here, Mike.
Sagal, hello, Kim. My name is Ann Deer. I work at McGill University in Mohawk, Pumackwasasni. We've chatted on social media and I follow you quite a bit. My question isn't about the forum. My question is, how do I get you to McGill to speak in person?
I have to be scheduled out quite a ways. I'm trying to say no to more, but yeah, I mean, send me an email. I'm just scheduling out quite well over a year at this point. But yeah, great coffee in Montreal. I'll come out.
What we could also do is we had some questions in our conversation circles. We could also use some of those. I'd love,
Yeah, that would be great. I'd love to be involved in that since I can't be there. I wish I could be there.
does someone want to read one of them? Oh. Oh, if you have a different question, absolutely.
Hi, my name is Kat Pasquatch. I'm joining from the University of Windsor and thinking about the words that you shared, that we have the capacity to do it. And
Mhm.
I think it sits in direct opposition of how I feel that we don't have capacity to do it. A part of the conversation I guess we did in our circle earlier is I bring up the concern that we need to be empowering our home communities and our nations to be able to self-determine that identity, that they're not capable of it. And then I think of my home communities, and the challenges that they're facing are not related to identity right now. They're looking at drug overdoses and the clean water and like the very on the ground battles that they're facing. And that this particular problem sits much differently. Like the problems we face in academia sit much differently than what I see my family facing back home. So that capacity thing is not sitting right with me.
Yeah, when
but
I talk about, go ahead.
so just wanted to say there was something that you suggested, and which I have brought up at our institution, that we need to hire people to be able to to determine that, to be able to sit down and empower students that don't, from my perspective, empower people that know they have the lineage but don't know how to prove it. And like they want to be able to demonstrate that kinship because whatever their story is, and that's what we want them to be able to reclaim that identity. And effectively we'll then do the opposite. We'll be able to show who is not a part of the communities. And so you sharing that part, I think, was really important, that as institutions, we should be able to work with the First Nations around us and empower them to have those resources, because they're so underfunded and they don't have the capacity to do it. So
Right.
I guess
When I
it's
said
not a question, just a reflection.
Yeah, when I said we have the capacity, I mean, we in the university have the capacity. But remember, I'm at the University of Alberta, right? So there's already a lot of Native people there. It's the reason I came there from the University of Texas and why I left the University of California, Berkeley. I wanted to be at a place where Native people's issues are central, where we have programmatic strength and where we have numbers. I know that's not the case at every single university, so that's where I meant we have the capacity. I do think there are Native communities that has some that have more capacity than others, but you're right, it's going to be uneven. I've been talking to people from US-based tribes, for example, that have some pretty decent economic development stuff going on. They could take more of a lead. So I do think where we have the capacity, those people need to take more of a lead. And I see this is not about identity, as I've said. This is why I don't like that word. This is about belonging, right? This is very different. Identity is a very individualistic idea. So I do see this issue as deeply interrelated with natural resource claims, with hunting rights claims, with claims to our children, with claims to our ancestral remains. These are all issues that we care very much about on the ground. I do get that some communities are so strapped that obviously this issue would be lower down for them. But I do think that it's our responsibility, those of us who work on this topic, to be very clear about how this is entangled with and mutually supporting of these other kinds of money grabs, resource grabs that are happening by settlers against our communities. I really like the idea that you posed of hiring the universities that can, of hiring somebody to help, say somebody, you know, hasn't done the work that they need to get enrolled or deal with, you know, Métis Nation of Alberta to get documentation. I think that's a great idea to help support people to do that. I love that idea. I hadn't thought of that before. Having somebody there, you're saying, to maybe help students do that work, that would be great, because it would also help them connect, right? And help them connect to more resources, help them connect to people that can get them reacquainted with those communities. So yeah, I think that's a really great idea.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. So I wanted to ask before the McGill person if you'd come to Saskatchewan first in person. So no, hi Kim. No, my name is Neil Cusef. I have a real question though, and it kind of ties into what Jean was saying earlier. I've been paying attention to the idea of the collectivism versus the individualism. And one of the things that Jean mentioned in her presentation, and I'm sorry, Kim, I know you didn't have the opportunity to participate all day, but you might have some ideas on. So there's a case that's actually going forward to the Supreme Court of Canada, and it's based out of Yukon right now, and it's in the governance realm. And they're pulling out some human rights grounds to stand on to challenge kind of the governance system in their respective community. Old Crow, I believe it is actually. And just so will that have any implications on this conversation? And for those of you that aren't familiar, it's a person who is actually challenging their own First Nations
Online.
constitution because they're not able to relocate to their home nation in the event that they're elected, right? And they're using a human rights grounds to say they're being discriminated on those grounds versus right. So
I can't respond. I don't know the case, and I don't know human rights law, but I've seen that this is a topic that keeps coming up, right? Human rights law being deployed against what's the word I should use here? Indigenous sovereignty. You see, it's becoming impossible for me to talk because I don't want to use the I words. Yeah, no, I can't answer that question, but I'm interested and I'm paying attention. I'm sorry I missed that talk, because I see the conversation kind of erupting out on Native Twitter right now and in the news. So
we have two questions from online. The first question is, I'm wondering how do we move past silencing each other about identity issues?
I need an example of somebody silencing somebody on an identity issue. I don't know what that's referring to.
I don't have any additional context. We can move on to the second question, which is,
if they want to put context in, I'm happy to try to respond.
at last year's forum, a speaker said words to the effect of, Indigenous identity isn't Indigenous people's problem, it's the settler institution's problem. Do you agree?
Yeah, especially as we conceptualize it as Indigenous identity. I think that's a problem. But we are stuck here with the ramifications of this problem, right? So yes, we can, you know, and I think I've said that this is white supremacy and settler colonialism causing this problem, and yet we are forced to respond and push back. So, but I'm interested, you know, if people have, you know, I tend to focus on, I guess I tend to focus on what we can do because having grown up in a Native community that was always in crisis, you know, it's second nature to me to kind of get organized and respond to that crisis, I'm not so strategic about thinking about how the settler should respond. I mean, other than I sort of incrementally figure that as I go along. But I don't know if that person or if others have ideas about, you know, maybe I am putting too much emphasis on what we can do and not enough on what they should do. So I'm interested to hear ideas that people have about that. But yeah, I agree. I mean, but it is our problem too, you know, because we inherit the ramifications of it.
Mike over here. Sherry, you want to put your hand again? Yeah.
Hi, Kim, Sherry Farrell Reset here.
Sharon.
We, like you mentioned, something that, I mean, it is related very seriously. You talked about your own research being derailed for the last few years because of being called upon to do this work. And I was half joking with a colleague about applying for a writer's retreat, which typically means people working on one publication. But there would be a group of Indigenous women whose research and publishing careers have been derailed by doing the actual grunt work of uprooting people that are, you know, that were, because it's probably 10 people that are doing this work.
Yeah.
It might be more, but I bet you anything you could nail it down to about 10 people.
Mhm.
And how, well, like, so I guess my question would be, how do we distribute this unpleasant labor intensive work amongst our colleagues? And the second is, like, we have to move on two fronts. I mean, that's something that's come very clear. We have to continue to uproot deeply embedded people who are still in institutions. That's important, critical work because they are, you know, because of all the reasons. But secondly, they're being abetted by institutions like SHIRK, who are extremely sloppy, also Canada Research Chairs. And so there's like, we have to move on two fronts.
Yeah.
And we also have to be able to do the work that we love, which is also important work that our communities need. So I don't know, any thoughts? Do you want to be part of the grant for the writing retreat?
Yeah, you know, I was going to do a proposal for a major trade press to do a book on this, and I decided not to. And I've said no to 2 other books. I mean, yeah, I do need to write something. I've got a lot of stuff, right? And if this is what I've been working on since January of 2021, I guess I better publish something and not just do interviews and talks all the time. Yeah, I mean, I think those would be really helpful testimonies to write. I do think there's more. Well, I maybe in the academy, the people doing the heavy lifting in Canada are a few. Although I do think, like at UBC, you know, I keep track of who likes my tweets and who, I mean, I don't totally keep track because I ignore trolls completely. I don't care what they say. I don't look at what they say. But, you know, I notice well-placed Indigenous faculty who were not being very loud themselves on social media about what was happening with METL. I think there was a lot going on behind the scenes. I think people were pushing. One of the things I've noticed is I do think it's easier the farther away you are. I mean, there are people at the heart of these cases. So we saw the women who continue to be very vocal in Saskatchewan, for example, right? But I do think the pressure that the Indigenous Women's Collective put on UBC from a distance was, I think there's a role for people that are farther away, putting that kind of vocal pressure on institutions, maybe while the people who are closer to and inside the institutions are working more quietly and behind the scenes. I think for some people in BC, for some Indigenous women, especially in BC, who are within Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafon's orbit, it was very dicey and very scary. But I do think people that are in those situations and who fear that there's real risk to their financial and emotional well-being by speaking out, I do know that they sometimes feed information and data to people who are farther away who can take a more vocal stand. In the United States, there are many, many people across Indian country who are feeding information to people that are taking a more vocal stand on this. I get emails all the time saying, thank you. I can't speak out. I was bullied. My children were bullied. I can't afford to lose my job. This is happening. So I don't think everybody has to be out front on this. I think some of us are more well placed to be out front. What I would like is for those who don't feel they're so well placed and who are genuinely afraid, please don't troll us. Please don't scapegoat us. Please don't try to make yourself feel better than us. Just sit with your discomfort and your quiet, right? Don't add to the problem, I guess would be my feeling. So, and I'm grateful for the women that are out front. I'm really grateful. It also gives me strength and it gives me more courage. I mean, I've fought from the beginning to have courage on this issue, but some days it's hard. And when you see, especially other women around the country, also standing up and speaking out, it makes you feel like, okay, maybe it is okay to do this and be out front on this. So yeah, let's talk about your plan, your proposal. I don't know if I answered the whole question, Sherry, if there's more.
That's great. Over here, Mike.
Kim, it's Celeste Pedri Spade. I'm at McGill University now. Hi. Thank you so much for your talk. So one of the things that you raised I just got me thinking about how we need to be careful about the way we talk about these issues, because our words can be misused and at times abused by people who are making either false or tenuous claims. And so one of the things that often make I find uncomfortable, and I know that there's others in my family that feel a little bit uncomfortable at times, is the way that and I think you used the word white passing or white coated or white bodied Indigenous peoples, the way they talk about blood and race in the context of belonging. And I think this is heightened, or perhaps that uncomfortableness is heightened because people who often make tenuous claims, they often say things like, being Native isn't about blood, it's not about race. But of course, the irony is that their claim is based on locating just a little bit of it, like in their ancestral past.
Yeah, it's more biologically essentialist than
That,
anybody's.
it's right. So there's the irony in that. And so, I've just thought about, it also, seems that kind of comment seems really disrespectful to Indigenous families who, have lost people, for the very fact that they live every moment of their life as a visible Native person. And that's a reality in a lot of our families. And so do you think, is there a better way that we can bring in conversations about race and the diversity of indigeneity to this conversation around identity, belonging, citizenship? Or do you think it's another topic, and we could talk about it somewhere else?
Yeah, I mean, I really like the way Jessica Kolopenik is in this article that's forthcoming, is really taking this on as a white coated person, right? And she's talking through some personal anecdotes of how she's had to deal with this and the questioning of her, even though she's both a connected person, but disenfranchised in her family through the Indian Act, right? So she really kind of roots her own connectedness and disconnectedness over multi-generations in a deep treatment of federal Indian policy. So I think this is really helpful, plus the personal experience. So I do think that we should be talking about the intersections of race and nation in relationship to this topic. I think we need people who actually deeply understand the intersections of race and nation. There's a whole lot of people out there that are spouting, I'm going to try to be careful how I say this. They're really implicitly anti-Native nonsense that comes out of some humanities fields, particularly in the US, right? I think that is really, really, there's a lot of explicit and implicit anti-Native sentiment in some fields that are theorizing race. This is why I've always paid a lot of attention since the beginning of my academic career to really paying attention to race politics, how race shifts over time and place, how those definitions shift, the particular way in which Native people have been racialized in relationship to whiteness. It is not the same that Black people have been racialized in relationship to whiteness. And it's got to do with them needing to dispossess us of our land and them needing to extract free labor from enslaved people. So there are very particular reasons, material reasons, why we're racialized in different ways in relationship to whiteness. We need to understand that history. We also need to have a healthy knowledge of and respect for Native nation sovereignty. And there are very few of us who pay deep attention to both of those things and how they intersect. So yeah, I do think we should be talking about it. It's an important part of the conversation. There's a tremendous amount of knee-jerk reaction, sloppy thinking out there. A lot of people who could have legitimate connections to Native nations are relying on this sloppy thinking. They're not really well schooled in the intersections of these things. And so I think, yeah, we need to be, I think we've got this kind of scholarship going on where we can address these issues. I just don't think it's necessarily getting read, and I don't think it's the dominant scholarship on race across the disciplines that are having influence over this conversation. So, I mean, this is a much longer conversation. I hope it makes sense where I'm going to you.
She said yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I think about this a lot, and I try to in the talks that I give on why we can't just use DNA to adjudicate these problems. I go through a history of race and how red is racialized. I go through a history of federal Indian policy, and then I get to a point where I say, okay, given these particular histories, These are the conceptual conditions within which we have people making claims to be Native American via DNA, via ancestry alone. They're not just creating these things out of thin air. The path has been laid for them by old school race thinking, by contemporary multiculturalist thought, by a contemporary anti-racist thought that's not actually considering Native sovereignty at the intersection of what it's doing. So I think there's a few of us out there trying to make these intersections, but it's certainly not the majority of people weighing in on these conversations. And so.
Yeah. And we have another question, Priscilla?
Yeah, Priscilla City. I'm currently the interim vice dean for Indigenous for the College of Arts and Science. And I'm really glad that you pulled together the connection between Indigenous sovereignty and the topic at hand. Last week, our province governing body just passed the Saskatchewan First Law amidst, widespread protests by both treaty, and status and non-status and Métis people. And it's a really dangerous act that gives the province full entitlement to all of the resources. And I think it's really important what you said about drawing that parallel between Indigenous sovereignty and, what's going on in some of the academies. So thank you.
Nice to hear from you, Priscilla. Yeah, I hadn't read that. I'll have to catch up on that news.
I also just want to say thanks to Kim. I'm not wrapping up or anything. I want to say thank you for recognizing those voices that are speaking out, and that I think we've talked a lot about that, and I appreciate that. I think that's one of the hardest things to do. You're not only carrying a load of working with your community, you're doing your thing at the university, which comes with a lot of other things, a lot of committees, a lot of talks. And then on top of that, these women, these Indigenous women are carrying also that load of whistleblowing and then getting that blowback. And so I really appreciate that, you recognizing that in this talk.
Yeah, I wrote an essay last year called, I don't know, 3 White Bullies or something, but it occurred to me in the last couple of years, I kept thinking about these white cheerleaders that harassed me on the playground. 6th grade. And then this other white bully kid, I was thinking about all these white bullies in my childhood, and I was like, God, this feels like that. And I feel duped because I'm carrying what they think. And it's, it took me a while to get my courage when I was in 6th grade and then 7th grade. And so I wrote a piece comparing pretendians and their defenders to the white bullies who harassed me in my childhood. But I'm really grateful for those white bullies now, because Twitter is not scary like a pack of white girls threatening you on the playground. Like, there was really good training for doing this work, and telling myself I'm gonna stand up anyway, even though, I'm getting bullied and harassed and called all kinds of names. And so, yeah, I'm so happy when I see it has been mostly other Native women stepping to the fore and doing the work. I'm so pleased to see the commentary that they make, see the interventions that they make. I mean, the Indigenous Women's Collective has done a lot, and they're being very strategic, I think, about what they're doing. So I really, really appreciate them quite a lot, both as individuals and as a group.
So not to genderize this, but what are your thoughts on this idea of, again, Indigenous women leading in this realm? Well,
I mean, I do know men too that are behind the scenes. I'm not sure what I think about that. That's how I grew up, right? Like, I was born in 1968 in the middle of the American Indian movement. And while you had all the photo op guys with their, braids and chokers and everything, who was really doing the work? It was women that was doing the work, that was organizing, that was, writing grants to build institutions. I talked about this earlier today where I am in Philadelphia. People only think, when they think about the American Indian movement and those problematic men, but those are the images that they have in their head. But really, a lot of the real life-changing work for people and for children on the ground, institution building, was happening by women. That's just the world I grew up in. It's what I'm used to. So I don't know. Is it that men are just in the background if they're not stepping forward? Why are they not stepping forward? I mean, I hope some analyses about gender and who's picking up the heavy labor in this come out of all this. Are you all talking about this there? Have you had some good conversations?
Not on that specific realm, no, no.
Oh, maybe you will tomorrow.
Okay. I guess there's questions online.
We have another question from online from Geraldine King. What role does the white possessive and white feminism have to play in this? I think of the way that many of these false narratives center the presumption of an abusive native paternal line and or a violated and traumatized maternal line.
Yep. That Navajos case I cited, that's exactly what it is. Yeah. Yeah, I know exactly like what it, well, there's also been there have also been some narratives of the abusive native father too, right? But you're saying in general, Geraldine is saying that it's a centering of, say that again, can you read the question again? Or the gendered part of it?
Yes. So the question was, what role does the white possessive and white feminism have to play in this? I think of the way that many of these false narratives center the presumption of an abusive native paternal line and or a violated and traumatized maternal line.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Jessica Kolopenik is citing the white possessive actually in that piece that she's writing. I don't know, does Geraldine, was that you talking?
No, she's online.
Oh, okay. Well, I wonder if she has an answer. I'll bet she has an answer better than mine. But I do think about this, right? Like how were Native men portrayed in these narratives? And I mean, and this is anecdotal, but I feel like a lot of the stories that I've heard, there is kind of this portrayal of Native men as failures or abusers. I've heard many stories of, oh, you know, my mother was raped by a Native man. That's where this. So yeah, I think there's probably a good study that needs to be done of the gendered patterns of these stories as well, and then also the gender dynamics of who's making false claims. Are they disproportionately men, or are they disproportionately women? What fields are they coming out of? There was a Twitter conversation that Zoe Todd was having about that the other day, which I thought was really interesting, right? There's a sense by some people that we've had all these women who have been outed, but maybe there's a disproportionate attention being paid to women versus men. I wonder if this is a genuine question, I don't have the answer to this. Are there more women in academia doing this than are the men in other sectors? I know the LA Times story that broke a few years ago was focused on small business set-asides in the US. And the small businesses who were claiming to be Cherokee, the protagonists in those stories were all men. So I don't know if it's just a difference of sector or if it's actually that women are being disproportionately focused on, and why is that? Those are the questions that Zoe was entertaining in her Twitter thread.
Mhm.
Yeah. I don't have an answer to Geraldine ultimately. I mean, maybe I would if we could sit down and talk about it, but talk it through.
Hi, Kim, it's Jean Taye. Thanks
Jean.
for your interesting talk as always. I've learned so much from you. On this gendered issue, it strikes me there's a gendered issue that is arising in who jumps to the defense of these
Really?
Indian women. So,
men?
yeah. And this was brought to my attention by Winona Wheeler. So I want to credit her with this. But what she said is that it's men who appear to be, for METL certainly, jumping up to defend her. But also what Winona's pointing out is that, or what she said is, these are the same men who did not jump to the defense or when women were trying to get back into the community to get status back. These are the same men who put up roadblocks in those situations, but now they're jumping to the defense of the white woman. And also they're not the ones who will hire the Native woman lawyer, right?
Yeah.
And so Winona's, and I hope I'm capturing her comments correctly, but it struck me as a really interesting comment. So I was taking note of after she said that, of, yeah, actually there is a gendered aspect of it here too. And then the other thing I note is that Daryl LaRue points out that in academia, it's largely women who are who are being outed anyway, but he thinks it's largely women in academia who are pretending. But once you get into the hunting and fishing realm, it's 99% men.
Mhm.
So there, but in academia, and I would posit government, which has not been exposed yet. So I just wondered if you had some comment on what maybe on Winona's observations.
Yeah, I mean, I'm from the US, so I don't know all these players necessarily and all these histories and background. I think this is really fascinating, and it must be so enraging. It must be so enraging to see some Native men acting like that and doing that, right? Yeah, so I think, another thing to sort of expose and write about. It's really sad. But I'm learning from the news about that, and when these comments are made, I don't have the background. I don't know all the players. Are these comments will come out in this report? There will be some accounting of this kind of conversation in the report, I assume, from this forum.
Another question from the audience.
Okay.
Hi, Kim. It's Marilyn Petra. I'm a former academia person, and am right now working actually in my own business to create a court for the Métis Nation Saskatchewan.
Mhm.
And so my brain is around how do we resolve our own issues? My brain is around how do we create our own relationships? How do we mend them? My background's in law, and so we come from punishment and adversarial spaces. We come from really unhealthy ways to look at those issues. And I'm just thinking about talks about how long it takes to get to the courts about these issues, and some comments that you made in your presentation today. And how do we take ownership of this? So tomorrow we're going to hear from some elders, and we're going to hear about, perhaps some traditional teachings, perhaps some personal stories about how to mend those relationships. But my question to you is, in the work that you're doing across a continent, are you running into any spaces where communities themselves have taken this issue on? And so not waiting for courts and other bodies to kind of intervene. And I really think that we're at a place and a time where we need to be able to do that, given the complexities that we are facing. But I can't point to any places where there's examples of that. And some comments this morning that you wouldn't have heard either were things around, we keep, identities in English term, citizenships in English term, like we're stuck in those languages. And and yourself saying, even the word Indigenous. So if we were going to talk about Nehia, we were going to talk about Gitsan, we were going to talk about, Mohawk, their own language would have systems for that and resolution opportunities for that. Have you come across anything like that where people are going, no, we're not waiting for the University of Saskatchewan to get its poop in one place. We're going to do this ourselves.
No, and I'm in conversation. Well, so the one tribal chairperson in the US who has been vocal on this issue that I've come across, who was part of our Unsettling Genealogy Symposium, is Chief Ben Barnes from the Shawnee tribe. And I think he's been trying to talk to the US Tribal Chairmen's Association about this. My sister, I hope she wouldn't mind me quoting this. She said, she lives in DC. She's an attorney, Department of Energy. She works on civil rights issues, but she said, it's really hard. It's really hard to get tribal governments to pay attention to anything that they don't immediately understand is an immediate threat to tribal sovereignty. Then this is in the US. I mean, I don't know what your conversation would be like in Canada. So this is why I said we really, really need to make this very clear how this is an immediate threat to tribal governance. I am talking to some people in Southern California. There's talk about one of the tribes down there hosting a community-controlled symposium on this issue. And so I'm really hoping that happens sometime in the next 6 to 9 months. I think there is some interest by people in tribal government down there to talk about this. Particularly given what's going on in Hollywood. So their proximity to LA, I think, would make it such that these cases are really kind of front and center in the news cycle for them. But again, getting them to understand how this is affecting them, because even though they might only be 50 miles from LA, there's a world of difference between a reservation in Southern California and LA or Hollywood, right? And so people might still be as disconnected as you would be, you know, between DC and Oklahoma, for example. So so no, I don't know of anybody in community who's kind of taking the lead on this right now, but this is one of the things that I and others are advocating needs to start happening. Do you know of anything? I mean, because we hear, like the person earlier said, there's a lot of communities that are just so strapped, right? I get it. I think those that have the resources, and I think we're talking, some of the California tribes have some money. So it takes money to host a symposium like this, right? And so I don't think everybody needs to be at the forefront. I don't think everybody needs to be doing the same job. I think we all have different resources, different land bases, different capacities. I think it takes all of us attacking problems from different angles to get the work done. So I think it's okay if some people kind of take the lead first and others are slower to follow.
Oh, there were no examples. No.
No examples, yeah. I'm hoping that changes in the next year. I've had to have a conversation with a couple women at home because I'm in a tribal writers group in South Dakota, only Oceti Sakowin people. And, you know, we've got some of our own frauds and people at home, because I remember growing up there, it's like there's one or two, they marry in, they're not a threat. You know, they're not taking over tribal government. They're not taking over the tribal college. There's only one or two, they're not a threat, and they're married into your family. And you're like, oh man, that's so embarrassing. I can't call them out, and their kids are my cousins. That's not how it is out here. They're overpowering our voices. They're ending up in influential positions and making policy. They're theorizing the intersections of race and indigeneity in a way that's harmful to us. So I get why people at home don't quite understand what a big problem it is. You know, I think on the reservation, it's not as big a problem. But the thing is, the problems out here eventually filter down through policy, through the statistics that get produced about us that represent us as healthier and wealthier than we are. All of this eventually, I think, affects Indian country. It's just may not be immediately obvious because people are, as the earlier commenter said, they're always dealing with one thing after another. They got to deal with what's right in front of them. They don't have the capacity to look out and say what's going to be coming down the line in 5 or 10 years because there's some pretendian, you know, making their way through Harvard and going to end up in Washington, D.C. making policy related to us. So.
Oh, Mika has the mic.
Oh, good. Is she going to close us up now? I think it's about time.
Oh, there. Hi, Kim, it's Mika. I'm just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on what you said about the US having a low bar in regards to Indigenous citizenship and belonging and those things. What do you mean by a low bar?
I think I meant low bar, like in terms of, what was I talking about when I said that? I don't remember what I was talking about. I mean, it's got a low bar in so many ways. Was it in relationship to EDI stuff in the university?
Yeah.
I think it was. So I think I talked a bit about how multiculturalist discourse is a problem in EDI and the way that it shapes EDI, right? And that's not the kind of EDI that we need as Native nations. And I think I was saying that I feel like we are having pretty good conversations at the University of Alberta. There's a lot more we could do, and there's internal critique and debate, but we're doing a lot more. I travel around to a lot of US universities. They're doing nothing compared to what we're doing at U of A or in Saskatchewan or at McGill now. I mean, really, and probably other places I don't know about. So, and again, it's not because Canada's better, it's because we've had more assertive Native people there. And I was saying this in a talk I gave earlier today. One of the things that I've really been fortunate to benefit from in moving to Alberta is I think there's two things that make a difference in being in Canada versus being in the US. Native people are overall a larger percentage of the population there. And I think numbers matter. I think numbers matter. Population size matters. You're harder to ignore the more numbers you have. You're also harder to ignore in the west of the US, where tribes have millions of acres of land holdings. And I was saying to these people at this Ivy League university on the east, you don't have to see us. You don't have to deal with us. And there's much more of the US in which that's the reality, I think, than in Canada, where you can ignore and erase Indigenous people. And so the other thing, so I've really benefited in my programming and in my work and in my own critical thought by being in Alberta, because there's so many more Native people doing this work, articulating the problem, pushing back against the settler state. I also think it's very hard in the United States. It's the world's only superpower, although I don't think that's going to be the case for much longer. It's very, very hard to have a critique of the settler state when you live in the world's only superpower. It is so overwhelming. It is a very propagandized nation. I do think it's easier when you're sitting across the alley from the US. And I feel like I've gotten more critical in my own estimation of the settler state. I've gotten more expansive in my thinking about what's possible because these more critical anti-state Indigenous voices in Canada. So again, it's not Canada that's better. I feel like it's Indigenous people up there that are more critical on the whole. And I do think that has something to do with population, and I think it has to do with location. But I'm still only 7.5 years in, and I'm still trying to figure it out. So that's probably what I meant by, I'm not trying to say Canada's great. I'm just saying the US is such a low bar. It's hard not to be better. But I don't attribute that to white Canada by any means.
That was good
Be
clarification.
careful. Don't want to get in trouble.
You're already in trouble all the time, so
I
why
know.
stop now, really?
That's true.
Why we love you. Questions, comments?
I think we're almost at time, right? That was a great conversation. I really wish I could be there tomorrow. I'm going to be on a plane all day going back to Edmonton.
Mm. Yeah. We're good. Okay. I think I don't think I do the wrap up. You do the wrap up. But I would like to say, if you can see me, thank you for being here. We really appreciate your brain, your personality, your strength and courage. Yeah. And I think you should come to McMaster. That's all. I'll stop with that.
I like Hamilton. I'll visit. Thank you.
Hi, Kim. I just wanted to acknowledge and say, I think you've been in Canada long enough to recognize we've got a saying up here. When we say you're deadly, that means it's a really good thing, and you're pretty deadly, Kim TallBear.
Thank you.
We love you again. Please join me again in thanking Dr. Kim TallBear for all of her work in fighting off all these gosh darn trolls and getting this conversation to the forefront where it needs to be, and for keeping our space nice and safe. So thank you very much, Dr. TallBear.
Thank you. You all have a great rest of the conference. Bye.
I want to put a call out to all the Indigenous men like myself. Come on, act right. No, I'm just joking. But no, for real though, I think it's super motivating, and one of the things, with that I won't joke about is some of the words that my grandfather left before he finished his circle on the world here. He said, we're going to be okay when our women are leading us, and I think we're going to be okay through this one too. So again, it's not without its battles. We just heard Dr. TallBear talk to us kind of what she's been exposed to on our collective behalf, on fighting those things. So as someone who just, I couldn't get enough of it. I was just glued to my seat. So thank you very much to Dr. TallBear and Dr. Bear for getting us through that conversation. I got all these cases to look up, this Navajos, the Cedar Sherbert, like, gosh, that was super awesome. So one of the things though, before we go in, it's been a super long day. It's been an awesome day. I think, a lot of the energy is out of here. And I think all of our hamsters are collectively turning, just excited for what's going to happen tomorrow. I think we're all super excited. So just, I want to say with the feedback was heard last year about centering more student voices in our programming. So for the end of the day remarks today, we want to give a student from McGill University an opportunity, Angel Oliver. If I can invite Angel up to share some words. Angel is a Ojibwe from Gosh, Angel, you're going to help me out on this one. but she is from a First Nation in Ontario, and she is going to not butcher the name, but her Indigenous name is Ozawa Biminisik, which means yellow bird. She is currently completing a master's degree in occupational therapy at McGill University. Please join me in welcoming Angel.
Hello. Yeah, there's a lot of people here. I haven't spoken in front of a lot of people for a long time, so if I have to take a drink of water, just don't mind me. First, I'd like to thank the speakers and performers of today, as well as everyone that participated here. It's amazing to see so many educated people in one room, as well as the people that joined us on Zoom. I'd also like to thank the creator that we're all here and that we were able to honor this event in the pipe ceremony this morning. So miigwech. As he said, my name is Angel. My Indian name given to me is Ozawa bin Nasik, which means yellow bird. I live in British Columbia, which is where I completed my undergraduate degree in biochemistry at the University of Victoria. And now I'm completing my master's degree in occupational therapy at McGill. I come from Whitefish Bay in Lake of the Woods, Ontario. That was that name that he was trying to say. I also can't really say it that well. So it's that. Growing up, I would say that I really dissociated from my identity because of racism and discrimination that I experienced as a child. And as a youth, like I didn't know how to process this or support myself or protect myself. So I'm learning now more of my culture from my mom. I kind of feel like I'm 5. Like I feel like I'm relearning everything and absorbing everything. So I'm very new to this. I had heard about the things that we were talking about today, but I never really knew to what extent until I kind of, listened to the speakers today and participated in the conversations that we had at our tables. I wanted to talk about my perspective as a health sciences student on this matter at McGill. And I'm just clarifying, like, I'm not speaking for other departments. I just want to kind of shed my own perspective on my experience and maybe of how students are affected by this, issue that we're kind of facing today. So McGill attempts to show its acceptance and its knowledge of Indigenous culture and traditions, and it aims to protect and support their Indigenous students and faculty. It's a great school. I love my program and I can appreciate the efforts in the classroom, but really the only place that I feel comfortable is at the First Peoples House. This is a place that I feel supported and protected. Our OT curriculum requires that professors have to address the events that our people have suffered in the past, or do cultural activities like visiting a longhouse, for example. These classes aren't led by those who are Indigenous, and my program doesn't have any Indigenous professors. So these workshops are run by professors who feel that they are a part of these communities and culture, which they may be. A professor in my department specifically has a good relationship with the communities around Montreal. And so they hold the responsibility for these classes and workshops being organized. Though they are knowledgeable, some of their behaviors sit a little uneasily with me. My peer who is Métis as well, and even my classmates who aren't Indigenous find issues with the way that they act. I can appreciate that they invested time and interest in Indigenous people and cultures, but I'm not sure that they approach it respectfully. Though I don't think that they're aware of what they're doing. Or like what their actions can imply. Their partner is also a professor in my program, and halfway through one of their classes that they teach in the semester, we tend to take a stretch and mobility break because it's about ergonomics and movement. And so we would follow YouTube videos for stretching or yoga or, movement in some way. During Indigenous Awareness Week this year, we took a break to move around and they put on a YouTube video of how to do a powwow dance. And yeah, they assumed that this was an okay thing to do since their white partner was the Indigenous representative of my program, who would know that this would be the right thing to do or not. I wouldn't say that either of them are trying to be Indigenous or act like they are, but they cross boundaries that I as a student am not comfortable with. And this makes me feel vulnerable, disrespected, and unsupported in my institution. These actions may be a gray area, but to me, it's acting as someone that they are not, or claiming to be a part of or have knowledge of something that they are not. Bringing up these actions to my directors or professors, that makes me scared as a student that I will be in the wrong or that I will be punished in some way for speaking up. I'm even scared to talk about this now, just in case they see this. But it's an important conversation and it's what I feel like I need to participate in. Today, I am really grateful to have learned so much from those who spoke today and to begin this conversation within myself and with others. I have always been the only one or of a very few Indigenous persons in any of my classes in my academic career. And in this, especially now, I feel the responsibility to share what we are discussing over the next couple of days. There's a quote that states, "Nothing about us without us," which means that no policy should be decided by any representative without the full and direct participation of members of the groups affected by that policy. In that case, this is everyone here, and I'm proud to be a part of this group and make the change. So have a good evening. I'll see you all at dinner.
This just in, she's pretty good. Good job, Angel. You're super awesome. Thank you very much. Keep it up. It's always super exciting to see our young people leading the way and yeah, just taking up the space. Super great. We are going to be having a little bit of a break for our particular space here for the evening. We are transitioning to the evening's event while we say goodbye to our virtual attendees for the day. Got some important messages for all the lovely folks that are still here with us today.